Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm here today to talk to you about the Fujifilm X-H1. I've come to a new location for me, and my previous favourite location for doing these kinds of videos are a little bit unsuitable, I found from reviewing the footage. The mill back in my hometown is a little bit overgrown this time of the year here in the summer in the UK. And my second favourite location, which is Holness Church, is right on a busy A road, so it's very noisy from an audio perspective. Whereas here in this setting, it's a lot more peaceful, apart from the livestock in the adjoining fields. So I've owned the Fujifilm X-H1 now for about 11 months, so nearly a year, and I've used it quite extensively in that time. So I feel like now is the time to draw my thoughts together and produce this video. I've revised what I wanted to say quite a lot because I really from the outset wanted to love this camera, because don't get me wrong, there's some aspects of this camera that I really do enjoy using, but ultimately it hasn't really performed as well as I was hoping it would. So why did I get this camera in the first place? Well, I loved using the Fujifilm X-E1, so I wanted to see what a more modern, advanced Fujifilm camera would be able to afford me. And this was a good proposition to try as well, to see whether I could envisage a switch away from my Olympus camera bodies to a more Fujifilm camera ecosystem. Has the Fujifilm, and specifically the X-H1, done enough to replace my Olympus system, specifically this camera, the Olympus EM1 Mark II? So as I mentioned, there's a lot of things that I like using about this camera, but I don't feel that there is enough there that has enabled the scales to tip in favour of changing over to Fujifilm cameras and away from my Olympus bodies. I will go into this video and talk about my specific likes and dislikes about this camera, but there's probably 2 or 3 main reasons why I'm looking to move away from the X-H1 and go back to using the Olympus system as my primary camera moving forward. So they are basically centered around image quality. I did this video here where I looked at the X-Trans1 images from my X-E1 with the X-Trans3 images from the X-H1, and I'm not going to labour too much more on that. Suffice to say that I still preferred the look from that old X-Trans1 sensor, which is in the X-E1 and of course the X Pro 1. After I did do that video comparing these two cameras, or their output of these two cameras, I did use Fujifilm's X-Raw Studio to try and develop a film sim recipe that would equal or get close to the X-E1's output, or just produce a JPEG out of camera look that I like the look of, which I could then use as a starting point in my raw post-processing. But I just couldn't get close to the straight out of camera Pavia output that the X-E1 does so well. I'll come on to it a little bit as well later on, but I did find that trying to change the highlights, the shadows, the colours, etc. in the Fuji X-H1 and the X-E1, the adjustments that you can make are too severe. It's either too much shadow or not enough. You can't really, I find, replicate what you can do in software packages like Lightroom to process your raw files when you've captured your compositions to suit your tastes. I did briefly consider as well trying some other Fujifilm cameras, so I was looking at the X-T1, the X-T10, the X-T3, the X-T4, etc, etc, but I hear that basically after the X-E1 the image quality doesn't really get much better and it becomes almost a more clinical digital looking image rather than the more filmic rendering that the X-H1 and the X Pro 1 can produce. So that pretty much stopped my Fuji experiment dead in its tracks. The second reason is a combination of the CAF performance, so the continuous autofocus, along with its burst speeds to capture fast-paced action or wildlife, etc. And that need kind of developed for me in my ownership of this camera, in that we got a puppy back end of last year. So my needs for capturing faster kind of animals, such as my puppy, became more of a need. So I obviously did a lot of shooting with this camera, and I did a lot of research trying to find the optimum settings, did a lot of experimentation, and did settle on a setting that did give me the best results. But I tended still to prefer the results and the performance of my Olympus camera, specifically the EM1 Mark II. When I did some comparison images, again, I tended to prefer the images that I was able to capture with the Olympus camera here. And there's some other benefits as well to the Olympus camera. It's got some insane shooting speeds. The distortion or the rolling shutter was much worse on the X-H1 compared to the Olympus system. So yeah, just to hammer that point home, looking over the last few months of shots that I've taken of my puppy Billy running, and there's been quite a few, I can tell you that my favourites were consistently taken on the Olympus EM1 Mark II. So yeah, the X-H1, even though it did produce some good images, they just weren't as consistently good as opposed to the Olympus. I did briefly consider over the last few months whether to get some better glass for the X-H1, you know, a better zoom to equal that of the 12-40 Pro on my mirrorless camera. But I did discount the 16-55 because I thought it was a little bit too heavy, and I was a bit put off with some of the variable reviews regarding the other zoom lenses in Fuji's arsenal, and I wasn't really sure what it would give me more than what my 12-40 Pro already does so well with my Olympus system. So I stuck with just the 15-45, 50-30 and the 35mm 1.4 with the Fuji. And don't get me wrong, I did take some really nice shots, especially with the 35mm 1.4 wide open, but overall I tended to prefer, and I still do tend to prefer, the images that I get from the EM1 Mark II when I'm shooting that kind of a subject. Slightly leading on from that, I do find it much easier to switch between shooting modes with my Olympus cameras. Literally, it's got a great custom mode implementation on the mode dial here, and basically I've set it up so that if I want to just shoot general photography, so auto IBIS, just auto shutter speed, and then I can just set the aperture and fire away. Just one click to the left to C2. That takes me to a tripod only shooting mode when I want low ISO, no IBIS, stabilization for tripod photography. And then the C3 selection then allows me to shoot shots of my puppy running, etc. It's set at a automatic ISO. IBIS is off because there's thoughts that there's little value with IBIS when you're shooting fast shutter speed. So the shutter speed is on to manual, as is the aperture, so it's full manual control, so I can then fully control the aperture and the shutter speed to make sure I get those sharp shots at the expense of maybe a higher ISO. But then with advances in software from Adobe with its AI denoise, noise on Micro Four Thirds cameras is less of an issue. Like I shot this shot here a few months ago, or back in winter time, of Billy running through the woods with some mist, and it was shot at ISO 6400 in order to get that action frozen. And initially the shot did look terrible in terms of noise, but just run it through DxO's Prime that I was trialing at the time, and Adobe's AI noise feature works in a similar way, and you couldn't even tell now that it was shot at ISO 6400. It's just amazing how far software has come. So from that you can see that it's quite easy to switch between all the different shooting modes that I might want to use. And then of course you can just alter them on the fly, and then when you turn the camera off and on, they'll be reset to how you wanted them to be set at. So brilliant customization, and yeah, works really well out in the field, and you can quickly change between the different modes. Fujifilm doesn't really work like that. So don't get me wrong, I really like external controls on Fujifilm system for single autofocus, for just going out and shooting street photography, etc., where you can select the aperture, the ISO, your shutter speed, and then on some cameras as well, you can dial in some exposure compensation. It's a little bit more tricky on the X-H1, where you've got to press a button and then rotate a dial to do it. But if I then wanted to go from single autofocus mode to quickly shooting some pictures of my dog running towards me, it's not as simple as the Olympus system where it's just one click. You've got to remember to turn this dial to continuous here. You've got to then change the metering mode. You've then got to change the dial here to make sure that the right burst mode is selected. And then also as well, you've got to turn off IBIS by using the dials here. So there's a lot to think about and consider before you can then start composing the shots you want to take. And then quickly you see something that you just want to take a single autofocus shot of, and then you've got to switch it all back. And there's invariably been times where I haven't managed to set all the settings back to how they needed to be set, and I've ended up losing the shot. So I love them, but I also hate them as well at the same time. The exception to this on the Fuji system, certainly on the more modern Fuji systems, is that you can dial in the settings you want for your video modes, and then when you switch to the video dial, the settings are already saved there, ready for you to then shoot with, and that's quite a good implementation. It's just a shame that you can't do that with other modes as well. It's a shame why you can't have like a custom mode dial selection as well after the video selection on the dial below the ISO knob here. Right, so let's just briefly go through some of the other likes and dislikes with the X-H1 from my experiences thus far. Right, so one of the things I like about this camera most is the handling. Certainly compared to the XE1, you've got a great grip, which does fit my hand really well on the front, and then your hand, or my thumb certainly does work well with the controls on the camera. The downside to the better handling though is probably the weight. It's about 674 grams with just the body and the battery and the card, and that to me is erring on a little bit too heavy for a mirrorless camera. Like, I'm looking at getting a Sony A7S to try a full frame mirrorless camera, and that's only about 430 grams. Admittedly, the handling is not going to be as good as this camera, but I just feel that for a mirrorless camera, and for one which has got a crop sensor like this one, it shouldn't really be this heavy in practice. Right, so the second option I really like with this camera is the shutter sound. It's just such a nice sounding shutter, and obviously it's very, very light trigger, so you've often taken a shot before you've actually realized or you wanted to take a shot, and that has its downside. Sometimes your subject isn't ready, or you weren't ready, and you do, yeah, but it does take a bit of practice to get used to. And yeah, but generally on the whole, I do like the shutter and the sound of the shutter. Despite the XE1 sounding a little bit harsher, it does have one benefit over the X-H1, and that is the ability to use a manual cable release in the actual shutter. So you don't have to then worry about using self-timer. You can just fire it off when you want to, when for instance it's on a tripod. I would use the Fuji app for remote shutter, but I've never really been able to get it to work on either the XE1 or the X-H1, and the new app that Fujifilm have released doesn't even work on the X-H1 or the XE1, so I'm stuck to just using self-timer or the cable release on the XE1 when I want to do some remote photography. No such bother with my Olympus EM1 Mark II. The app connects and works fine in my experience. Right, so another thing I've actually really enjoyed using with the X-H1 is the amazing EVF, a really large OLED panel, it gives a very colourful and vibrant image, whereas opposed to my Olympus EM1 and EM1 Mark II, the LCD screen is not as good. It's very washed out. It's only an LCD screen. It's just not as good as the one in here. There is downsides to this one though, compared to my Olympus cameras, is that when it gets a bit lower light, I do find that the EVF, or the picture you're seeing, starts to lag a little bit. And then when you're in lower light or using ND filters, I find that the live view is really grainy compared to that which the EM1 Mark I and Mark II provide. So yeah, so overall I do like it, but I guess from a usability point of view, the Olympus EM1 and 1 Mark II is better because you can use it in all situations without that lag and a clearer live view when shooting with ND filters, etc. But for just general shooting, the EVF in this is a hard one to be, and I'll certainly be looking for that kind of a viewfinder in future cameras that I try. The X-H1, despite being a smaller viewfinder here, they use an OLED screen in it as well, so it does give a really good picture, albeit it's just a little bit slower and again a little bit laggier compared to the X-H1 and my Olympus systems. Right, so another like about this camera is the LCD screen. So let me just see if I can get this into a position. So as well as flipping in the normal orientation to look down and shoot, it also allows you to shoot in the vertical position low down as well. And this is brilliant, to be honest. I really like the uniqueness of this. It allows me to get some great low level shots or low level vertical shots with the design of that LCD screen. It was one of my reasons for getting rid of the Olympus EM5 Mark III, and then I wasn't really that keen on the articulated screen at that time, despite the advantages of being able to see oneself for vlogging like I'm doing now with the Osmo Pocket. But I generally found, from a photography point of view, that a traditional tilt screen and then with the vertical tilt screen is better. However, since getting a puppy and shooting a lot of running low level shots, I've actually found that the articulating screen on my EM1 Mark II is just as good, to be honest. And yeah, it's a trade-off in that I do like the vertical tilting screen, but obviously a fully articulated screen has benefits as well, such as lower level shooting, and as well as if I ever use my Olympus for vlogging, of course the screen will flip right round, so I can use that as well. So here's my Olympus camera. So obviously here you've got a fully articulating screen, and you can flip the screen like so. So you can even have it closed in on the back if you just want to use the viewfinder. But yeah, it's been great in that configuration to shoot some great shots of my puppy. But like I said, it's sometimes nice just to have a more traditional tilt screen on the back of the camera for general photography. I touched on this earlier as well, but I do like the manual focusing aids in the X-H1. It's got this great one called a dual display, where you can see a big screen of the whole composition that you're looking at shooting, and then a smaller screen off to one side that then allows you to see a magnified portion to help you nail that critical focus. Whilst I really enjoyed, from a usability point of view, using that mode, I generally didn't really find it any difference in terms of getting consistent results compared to when I use my Olympus cameras as well. So it's nice to have, but it's not a deal breaker for me. So I think that wraps up the main likes about this camera. I'll just move on now and talk about some of the dislikes, the annoyances that I've had when using the X-H1, beyond those main reasons that I gave towards the beginning of this video. So I might have alluded to this earlier, I'm not a massive fan of the film simulations in Fujifilm. It was an area that I was really looking forward to trying, especially with the X-H1 having classic chrome and at cross as well, rather than the normal monochrome. But I just didn't really like the look of any of them, to be honest. I prefer the straight arrow camera Previa for my X-H1, and then for any monochrome conversions that I want to do, yeah, it's great that you can see what it will look like roughly in monochrome, but in post-processing I prefer to use Silver FX Pro for all my monochrome conversion needs. Again, I wanted to try Fuji's X-Raw Studio as well, but the problem with the X-H1 is you're limited to exporting in JPEG only, rather than being able to export in TIFF or a DNG file for further processing. So that's a big limitation, and the software itself was a bit clunky and slow to use anyway, in that you had to have your X-H1 camera connected, because presumably the software uses the processor in the camera to do its work. The app to connect to the camera in order to use remote shuttering or to transfer images, I just could not get it to work at all in my time with the X-H1, and the new app that Fuji have developed does not work with the X-H1. It's too old. And that pretty much sums up Fuji's attitude towards the X-H1 a little bit as well. I do feel that they gave up on this camera a little bit too quickly compared to some of the others. It hasn't really received those Kaizen updates. They just gave up on it and moved on to the X-T3 and beyond, really, and didn't really give much of a second glance to the first in the line of the X-H1 or the X-H series, which is a real shame, because I feel like with a few more updates, some of the niggles that I've experienced, certainly with the EVF lag, might have been addressed. And maybe as well it would have improved the IBIS performance, because that's another, not so much, it's not a big dislike, because don't get me wrong, I don't really shoot a lot of photography that relies on IBIS, but compared to the Olympus implementation, I'm not a massive fan of the one in the X-H1. I don't find it to be that great from when I've used it, and I've always been a bit suspect as well with the shutter speed it's tried to use to capture a sharp image. More often than not, I don't find that it does, and you have to change that to make sure that you do get a sharp image. And another thing with the IBIS implementation on the X-H1 is even when you turn it off, you can still hear it. It basically has a levitation sensor where it basically always has to be on to centralize its position. So it still sounds like it's on even when it's off. Whereas the M1 Mark 1 that I had, you could hear it quite a bit, but in the Mark 2 variant, it's amazing how quiet they've made the IBIS in that camera. Right, so we're nearly there. I think that's all my likes and dislikes that I wanted to touch on. So take away the CAF performance and the image quality, what does that leave that would justify its continued place in my collection? Maybe it's the fact that I did think that this would be a one camera solution, so I could use it for my photography and for my videoing needs, just one camera to take out on trips to help reduce the weight, etc. But to be honest, despite the Osmo's issues and its limitations, certainly when shooting in lower light, because it's got a much smaller sensor than the one in the X-H1, I generally on the whole prefer the simplicity of the Osmo. The other advantage with the Osmo at the moment is obviously it's got a video screen, so I can see whether I'm in the frame still or whether I've gone out of frame. Admittedly, I can't see anything at the moment without my glasses on, but I can see a rough blur where my head normally is, and it still looks like it's in the frame. Whereas obviously with the X-H1, once you've set it up, you're kind of relying that you set it up right and you don't move around too much, that you're still in the frame. So yeah, I much prefer, okay, this is a much better video camera, but for my purposes, I just prefer using the Osmo Pocket, and it weighs a lot less as well. Yeah, sometimes as well, certainly setting up this shot, I've had to squint quite a bit to see whether I'm in the frame or whether, like, I tried to get the church in behind me to give you a little bit of interest rather than listen to me droning on, as well as hopefully some other interest in the background. And until I got this camera, I didn't appreciate the advantage of being able to see yourself when you're doing these types of videos. And if I wanted to have something that was better in lower light, then I could just use my Olympus EM1 Mark II with that fully articulated screens. Yeah, so there's nothing really left that the Fuji X-H1 does that would make me want to keep it, to be honest. Yeah, so my Fuji experiment has come to an end. For now, it won't be replacing Olympus is my main camera system, but I will be keeping the X-E1 and the Sublime 35mm f1.4 for those filmic type shots that the camera is so good at, and more often than not the straight out camera JPEG is more than enough for what I'm looking for. So I think that wraps up this video. That's about as much as I wanted to say about the X-H1. So I'll leave you with a montage of my favourite images that I've captured with the X-H1 since owning it. And as always, thanks for watching. Bye for now.